Hello. In this third meeting of the virtual program of formation for Augustinian vocation promoters and formators and the course Affectivity and the Celibate and Communal Life, we're going to be talking about the real reasons for celibacy, the purpose and the meaning of lives lived in this unusual way for human beings. So I've subtitled this one, Loneliness is the Point of Celibate Chastity, Not an Unfortunate Side Effect. Um, you know, we're not meant to be alone, and yet celibate chastity is going to put us in a state of loneliness. We're going to be looking at the reasons for that, what good it is, how it can be helpful, and also what we might need to do to form ourselves and to form those who are joining us to be ready to handle the loneliness that comes with celibate chastity. And a really important part of that is to understand the purpose and meaning of it. So some of the readings that we have, the main reading for this one is the chapter 4 from Sandra Snyder's book, Finding the Treasure. Religious life is a theological reality in the church, consecrated celibacy and the vocation to prophecy. She's going to make the case that this is a prophetic way of life. It is to send a message. It is to call attention to something in a unique and powerful way. And our celibacy is the key to our ability to be prophets to the world and to the church. And then there are two articles written by me, one on loneliness, and I think might have some good information about how we can form people for loneliness. And the second one is about our culture, the cultural reality in which we are living now, the culture that we need to be prophets to. I'm characterizing it as an addictive culture, trapped in an endless cycle of destructive behaviors. And somehow or another, our vocation to be chaste and celibate is a call to break the cycle of that addiction with new behaviors and new values. So this is a repeat from last time. The experience of life-giving celibate chastity is difficult and sometimes painful, and it's supposed to be difficult and sometimes painful. It is a vocation in and of itself. As Sandra Snyder's reminds us, it is the essence of a vocation to religious life. Very often, it's considered secondary to ministry or community life. But the purpose of being a religious, the main vocation, the call, is to life of celibate chastity. And I'm not so sure that that's something we emphasize enough. I think we often think of celibacy as something that, well, we got to do this if we want to be engaged in ministry or we want to live a community life. Celibacy comes along for the ride. And that's putting the cart before the horse. It's celibacy that drives and invites us and calls us to do ministry in a particular way and to live a community life in a particular way. And so community life isn't going to make up for the relationships that we sacrifice by a commitment to celibate chastity. I think we all know that if we've been living the common life for a while. It's not making up for the intimacy of marriage. It won't make up for the vocation of being a parent and having children to love. Poverty and obedience are vows that order our common life. Poverty in the sharing of goods, and obedience and our commitment to put the common good ahead of our own. But celibacy, celibate chastity, first and foremost, is an invitation to encounter God in a very profoundly different way, but a deep and meaningful way that will then call us to a prophetic way of life, sending messages to the world that we live in and the church we are part of. It comes with loneliness, lots and lots of loneliness. But it's that loneliness is the place where we can, if we are willing to endure it and invite it and embrace it, find a deep and meaningful relationship with God, a deeply contemplative relationship with God, making loneliness the point of celibate chastity. So the experience of celibate chastity is what makes religious life distinctive and prophetic. Every Christian is called to discover the gifts they are to share with others in community and ministry from within their state of life. For married people, it is this discovery of God's presence within and from the sacrificial giving and receiving of intimate life. We may think celibacy is hard. Marriage is very hard, as people know. For the ordained, who are not necessarily religious, it is the study and the proclamation of the Word of God and the celebration of the sacraments, in which they or we are called to encounter God and proclaim God's love and God's presence among us. But for those who are called to a life of celibate chastity, it is meant to be the discovery of God's intimate presence in the depths of an existential solitude, where we encounter our truest and most real selves being loved by God, and then sharing this love with others in community and through ministry. And there's going to be a prophetic nature to this experience of God that's going to set us apart to proclaim prophetically God's message to our world and to our church. So, did anyone sign up for us? And how are we going to promote this to vocations, to potential vocations? How are we going to tell them? Why are we celibate? And religious life is not for community, for ministry, or even community. It is that to enter into that state of existential solitude, as Sandra Snyder says, that no bonds, however deep, of friendship, community, or solidarity in mission can mitigate. It's a life of contemplative union with God, facilitated by the freedom from the obligations of marriage and family life and the demands of culture and society. Sandra Snyder reminds us that in the earliest days of the church, when the church was really a subversive institution trying to help people survive and find meaning and value in the brutalizing environment of the Roman Empire, that people were choosing not to engage in the business of the empire, not to engage in the sustaining of the empire. And one of the ways they would do that is to not have children, to not get married, not produce more citizens for the empire, as it were, or more slaves for the empire. It was a prophetic message. It was a protest against the dehumanizing effects of empire. And then, after the church is co-opted by the empire to become the official religion of the empire, religious found that scandal. Many people in the church found that scandalous and separated from it. Without leaving the church, they left the world, off to the desert, off to monasteries, off to solitude, saying that somehow or another, to be too much mixed with the church as it's too much mixed in with the world is not going to allow us to experience the fullness of God's saving love and not allow us to experience our call to proclaim the kingdom of God among us. Later, when the persecutions of the church stopped, people were embracing celibate chastity as another form of martyrdom, a way of giving one's whole life to God without engaging in the life of a secular life, to give one's whole self to God. And so monasteries arose in many ways. This is what Augustine was about. Augustine's time, his call to celibacy was that that's what real Christians did, because you couldn't be a martyr anymore. In our culture, we certainly are living in empires, big empires. And we are living in a world that is unsustainable, a world that is consuming itself, a world in which human beings are being consumed left and right. And so in my article on finding a spiritual path through an addictive culture, I point out three symptoms of how our culture is destroying itself in a slavery to addictions. The first is how we see our value. And we are not valued as children of God in our culture. We are not valued as individual, unique persons with dignity and respect. We are primarily valued as consumers of products. What good are we to the world? How much can we buy in order to sustain our unsustainable economic system? And the second way we're set we're set into the addictive cycle of our culture is the frantic competitiveness, where we are told that somehow or another, we are all going to be ranked in a hierarchical order from winners to losers. And if you're not a winner, you're a loser. Frantic competitiveness that causes us to compare ourselves to one another, to measure ourselves against standards of success that are unrealistic and impossible to meet, and a competitiveness that drives us to beat one another rather than collaborate and cooperate with one another. And the end result of that is that at the end, there are no winners because everybody ends up on the losing side of an unwinnable life. And the third symptom of this addictive culture is that it is terrified of loneliness. In fact, we are told over and over and over again, if you are lonely, there is something wrong with you, because everyone who's doesn't have something wrong with them is having a great time. Just look at all the things that you're missing out on, that everyone else is enjoying. We live in a technological culture in which we can be connected with millions and millions and millions of people instantly and have friends beyond counting. And yet, all that does is serve to point out how lonely we are, how isolated we are. And we are told repeatedly, don't be lonely, join, find, engage somehow or another. And all of that false engagement leads to only more loneliness. And so we do have a prophetic role in this world, this empire world. Even there's more to it than that, but nonetheless, our lifestyle, embracing the loneliness of celibate chastity, acknowledging that indeed we are lonely and it's okay to be lonely. And it's okay to share our loneliness with one another. In fact, the sharing of loneliness becomes the foundation of real community life. I recall that when I was working at Southdown, I had a client who was a member of a mendicant order who was dreading being discharged, which was strange. And he told me that he wasn't looking forward to being discharged because as soon as he was discharged, he was going to have to go to his community's provincial chapter. And he said, I hate going to provincial chapters. I hate going to provincial chapters because I walk into that room, I look around, and it's clear to me that everyone else in that room belongs there, but I don't. And when he shared that with me, I thought, that's exactly the way I feel. Everyone else belongs here, but I don't. And it occurred to me, I wonder if the thing that all of us share most in common is that we each believe that we're the only one who doesn't belong. I've checked that out over the years with members of my community, and I have found that it is pretty much true. We're all feeling left out, isolated, separated, and that's what we share most in common. And I wondered what if we were able to share that with one another instead of finding ways to put the masks on that make us pretend like we belong. Our lives of celibate chastity and our lives of simple living and poverty do call us to step out of the economic hurricane that's destroying our world, to put it aside, to stop being a consumer of products, and to focus on our value and the value of others as children of God. Does our celibacy allow that for us? Does it call us to that? Or do we end up using consuming as ways of mitigating the loneliness and somehow or another telling ourselves that we can take care of ourselves. We don't need to be lonely. And finally, life of celibate chastity should be stepping out of the competitive world. We are not fighting with anybody. We're not out to beat anybody. We are seeking God, and we are seeking the truth, and we are seeking to know ourselves, not in comparison with one another, but in the way we are known by the one who created us. And our celibacy should be putting us in the position where we can do that. Somehow or another, celibacy is meant to know God and to have God know us and to know ourselves even as we are known, as St. Augustine prayed for himself. Now, Sandra Snyder's goes a little bit further, and I think this is very important. Sandra Snyder's goes a little bit further and says that the existential solitude, the loneliness of our celibacy, puts us on the margins of society and in solidarity, therefore, with all those who are marginalized. It invites us to feel their separation, to join them in that separation, to speak for them in their separation, to call ourselves to the margins where we feel and know what it's like to be an object, to be considered nothing but labor for the workforce, to be considered as slaves, to be considered as commodities to be bought and sold in the marketplace, to be considered replaceable, not important enough. And there are so many places in our world where that is the truth. And so few places, really, where the comforts and the privileges, the safety, and the contentment, if you want to use that word, of having enough, of being secure and safe, of knowing ourselves as belonging, as being free to give ourselves away. Those places don't exist except on the margins and except by people who have been willing to embrace their marginalization. And in embracing their marginalization, find themselves in solidarity and community with everyone else. It's avoiding the marginalization. It's pretending that we do belong and we are the center of the world. That might be the most isolating thing of all. And we are invited through our existential solitude and loneliness to be engaged in solidarity with the vast majority of the human race. And of course, all of that should be a prophetic message to the church. The church is proclaiming the kingdom of heaven and not success in the secular world. Religious life has always had that role in the church, although we've often been co-opted away from that role. We're finding it again. And the source of that role is going to be our willingness to embrace the loneliness that comes with celibate chastity. So, how do we go about forming ourselves and others for lives of celibate chastity? What's necessary to live those lives with faithfulness, passion, and joy? Certainly, we need to embrace our celibate chastity without denial or illusion, as we talked about last week. Knowing ourselves as fully sexual persons with all the drives, needs, longings that entails, and fully aware that those longings will not be satisfied and those needs will not be met. And this is not a one and done situation. This probably happens 30 or 40 times a day, at least, that we have to embrace the reality that we are called not to engage in sexual intimacy in a physical way, but we are called to engage in intimacy in a celibate way. I think it also is going to involve cultivating and practicing, teaching and learning real contemplative prayer in solitude. Resources for doing that are more abundant than ever, perhaps, as the church rediscovers its history, its tradition, its gift of contemplation, and the solitude that's necessary to make that happen. Formation, I think, really needs to teach that, emphasize it, call us to it, as well as our prayer in common and our liturgical life, so that the two feed each other and somehow or another allow our celibacy and its existential loneliness to be invitations into contemplation and then invitations into real community life, where we know ourselves joined with one another, not by our gifts, but by our fragility, our vulnerability, our utter dependence on grace. Somehow or another, we need to practice and teach and learn those contemplative practices. And I think it also needs to really include formation for loneliness. And so that article that I wrote about loneliness as a place of revelation might be a place to start. Um, it's important that we tell the truth about the loneliness of a celibate life. And I think we have a tendency to maybe soft pedal that and encourage people to not feel the pain of loneliness too acutely, to avoid it. We pretend that there are ways of assuaging it. And there are lots of ways of assuaging the discomfort of loneliness. Most of them are not good. And if they become habit forming, they become the commitment of our life rather than the seeking of God in the existential solitude and to be called to a prophetic way of life for the church. So I think first step one, we need to be truly honest that if you're going to embrace a life of celibate chastity, if you're going to be avowed religious in the world today, you are going to experience lots of loneliness. If we try to say that ministry will make up for that, we're lying. If we try to say that even vibrant community life will make up for that, we're lying. And sometimes we need to say that ministry isn't always as satisfying as we think it will be, and then we're going to be stuck with our loneliness. And we need to emphasize that community life is not always going to be everything we think it will be. And when that happens, the loneliness is what we're going to be left with. Can we embrace that loneliness as our true vocation and enter it? So I think we need to help people in formation and throughout their lives as religious to then know how to enter loneliness and embrace it rather than tolerate it or avoid it. As I say in the article, solitude is when we are stuck with ourselves and enjoy the company. Loneliness is when we're stuck with ourselves and can't stand the company. It's part of getting to know our true and real selves. We are not just who we want to be. There's so much more to us. And often it's our loneliness that reveals to us all the ways we don't measure up, not only to the standards of our culture and society, but to ourselves. Those parts of us need to be embraced as well as our gifts, because it is those parts of us, the empty parts, the weak parts, the vulnerable parts, the places of shame in our lives that are invitations to the humility in which we can encounter the real God loving the real us. And again, we're going to be more in solidarity with more people when we're in that state than when we're assuming that we are just fine, that we belong, and we have it all together. And we need to develop ways of sharing our loneliness in community life rather than expecting community to remove it. I'm not quite sure exactly how to do it, but I have tried this a few times of acknowledging my loneliness to other friars and having them acknowledge theirs back. And then a conversation that's very different from most of the conversations we have with one another, have with other go. And again, I think it's really, really important that we understand that while we are called to this existential solitude that is often going to manifest itself as a noxious loneliness, we are certainly not alone in that. Even though our culture is terrified of loneliness, even though it puts in our hands tools to avoid it at all costs, people, everyone is experiencing a painful loneliness. Those of us who have talked to married couples know that marriage is not an antidote to loneliness. Even with its deep and profound intimacy, even the most well-married people have to learn to know what it is like to be lonely and to use that experience as a source of greater intimacy. Loneliness feeds intimacy. Intimacy doesn't remove loneliness. Certainly young people, college students, high school students, the levels of anxiety, depression, isolation, and loneliness in a world in which they can be connected to everyone instantly just is epidemic. And with it come the mental illness challenges, with it come the sense of suicidal ideations and a sense of emptiness and meaninglessness. We have something to tell them. And it's not, you don't have to be lonely. We're lonely. Can you see in us meaning and purpose and value, peace and serenity, even as we struggle with our loneliness, and a commitment to join them in their loneliness and walk with them through it will require us to be first comfortable with our own. And then maybe we can help them be comfortable with their loneliness. And certainly the elderly, those who are easily forgotten, those who are easily expendable, living lives of terrible loneliness, sadness, sometimes happiness. But can we join them and walk with them with our loneliness joining their loneliness, and so proclaiming in that way the reign of God? So the thing is, while we are called to an existential solitude by our vocation to celibate chastity, we're joining with the rest of the human race in that existential solitude. Our call is to know how to manage it, know how to enter it, know how to embrace it, know how to make it a source of grace, a source of self-awareness, and a source of the knowledge of God, so that it gives meaning and purpose to our lives, rather than telling us that our lives have no meaning and have no purpose. So, for your discussion board post this week, do you agree or disagree that loneliness is the point of celibate chastity? And why? How well does the Finding a Spiritual Path article capture the forces and realities impeding growth toward real human freedom and health in your cultural context? I wrote that from my cultural context. What other forces and realities would you include? What opportunities are or could be present in formation programs to challenge cultural norms and expectation and embrace life-giving spiritual paths? What prevents or impedes this? What might facilitate this? And how might students in formation be encouraged and assisted to enter and embrace loneliness as it presents itself to them? So if you can submit those discussion board posts, we'll be able to talk with one another about all of this on Wednesday when we meet synchronously. And then for your personal journals, when do you typically find yourself facing loneliness? And how do you respond? And in what experience of your life have you seen the shadow of your personality manifest? What did you discover in that encounter? Because as I say in the article on loneliness, loneliness reveals our shadow. We can't hide from it there. It comes out screaming and tells us what a loser we are because we're lonely. How does the shadow of your personality get manifested in your experiences of loneliness? All right. Thank you very much. Next week, we'll be talking more about community life, fraternal correction, the rule of St. Augustine, and how to do it effectively, as well as looking at some of the kinds of personalities that we probably need to be wary of as we're inviting people into religious life, informing them for religious life.